I just want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for their very generous invitation to speak this afternoon. I'm humbled by the invitation and hope my reflections in this paper, which I suspect are a little bit too rough and ready in their current form, open up a critical space that we can explore over the next couple of days within the wider symposium as well. So my comments are partly programmatic and speculative, and with that in mind, trying to carve out a kind of problem space or critical space that we can, in different ways, interrogate and challenge in the papers that follow. I should also say this is very much a paper that was kind of hanging over my head before the pandemic, and as someone who came off of parental leave the week before the March lockdown in 2020, it's very much muscle memory that's getting me back into thinking about these issues. So I offer something of an apologia by way of introduction. But what I want to do this afternoon is really begin to think along and against the grain of where it comes, when it comes to, if you like, readings of informality and housing tenure. Now, let me just see here. I'm just going to move this forward. Now, the starting point for this afternoon's talk actually takes me back to where much of my interest in urban squatting and housing insecurity began, which is namely the city of Vancouver, where I was a student in the distant fog of time. But this is also a starting point that takes me back to a conspicuous alignment of radical youth politics, creative protest, and alternative forms of living, which found expression in the squatter community that, as you see here, was created on the Maplewood intertidal mudflats in North Vancouver in the late 1960s. This is an intertidal zone of mudflats and salt marshes that are routinely exposed during low tide. And the mudflats are also part of the Pacific Flyway, which is a major migratory route for birds, and were designated many years later as a conservation area in the mid-1980s. Now, the history of foreshore squatting in Vancouver and on the mudflats dates back to much earlier, at least the 1940s, perhaps the 30s, in many parts of the city, and included, of course, the writer Malcolm Lowry, who completed Under the Volcano while living in Vancouver, and as I'm suggesting, is part of a much longer history of informal housing in Vancouver, as we see in the images that follow. Finn Slough remains an informal community to this day on the borders of what is now the community of Richmond. This is another example of the kind of informal community that we're talking about. But also, one of the things that I found in my own archival research is a kind of version of occupancy urbanism, if you want to borrow the phrase of Solomon Benjamin, which in some sense, you know, the attempts by many early squatters in Vancouver to formalize their occupation, and this is just one letter that was directed to the Planning and Parks Committee in the city of Vancouver, but equally the state itself providing its own kind of archive and inventory of foreshore squatting, and in some cases this was an attempt to formalize some of these actions, but in most cases it was a pretext to displacement and expulsion. Now, the community that briefly thrived in the late 1960s and early 1970s on the mudflats in North Vancouver, however, pointed to a radically different sense of shared city living. The prominent Canadian artist Tom Burrows, who moved to the mudflats in late 1969, described the older community as one with a traditional relationship to coastal British Columbia. Shake bolt and boom chain salvagers, he writes, crab fisher people. So by the late 1960s, many of these older residents had left their shacks or been forced out by a local lumber company, which had purchased part of the land in 1961. At the same time, a new generation of artists, activists, and other bohemians moved in, including Burrows. And in all cases, the squatters exploited the legal ambiguities of intertidal squatting. So in Canada, private property, as regulated by municipal zoning laws, only extends to the mean high tide mark, while the intertidal zone, I should say, was and remains the jurisdiction of the federal government. Now, as I've written elsewhere, the Maplewood squatters cultivated a modest ethics of mending and repair, as salvaged materials and do-it-yourself practices provided the main material support for their community. And again, Burrows describes how he slowly and incrementally transformed an abandoned, partially built structure into his own home. There was, he noted, and I quote, ample building material in a boom at the very far western edge of the flats where flotsam from Vancouver Harbor was corralled before it was chipped. I had weekends and long summer evenings to work on our new home. And with no power, I had to build a house with hand saws, he added. So as an experimental makeshift community, the Maplewood squatters represented, it would seem, the very antithesis to a city whose neighborhoods were increasingly being razed for condo high-rises. Now, in a highly influential essay on the history of the Vancouver art scene in the 1960s, the Canadian art historian Scott Watson describes how the intertidal squatters lived in active polemical opposition to the recent transformation of the city. The high tide mark that their community straddled was far more than a simple line in the sand between competing notions of property, between the house as a commodity and the home as a place of dwelling and refuge, and of course between the formal and the informal, if you like. It also pointed to a wider precarious existence, both urban and rural. It was, writes Watson, a bit of country ringed by the city, backed by the liminal forest that separated it from the growing bedroom suburb of North Vancouver. It faced the Shell oil refinery located across the waters of Burrard Inlet, and the same Shell refinery that in Malcolm Lowry's October Ferry had lost the S on its sign only to blaze a lurid hell across the inlet. Now, everyday life on the Mudflats was the subject of two contemporary films. Mudflats Living, which was a 1972 film produced by the National Film Board of Canada, one of many radical forays by the board into community-based documentary as part of what they described as a Challenge for Change program, which ran from 1967 to 1980. The second, Sean Malone's Living in the Mud, was an independent documentary that was more polemical and poetic in tone. And both films were nevertheless indebted to the wave of experimental filmmaking that thrived within the Vancouver art scene in this period. And the case of the National Film Board represented an institutional commitment to progressive social commentary. The films themselves also pointed to a form of dwelling that self-consciously blurred the boundaries between life and art. And for the artist Burroughs, the intertidal location of the Mudflats provided the supporting context for a new body of sculptural work shaped by the location's own diurnal rhythms. Heavily indebted to the situation, as Burroughs traded in the sandstone cobble and paving stone for the flotsam and jetsam of the tidal flats. As in the case of his new house, Burroughs' work incorporated materials that he had found and salvaged. As he later observed in an article published in Arts Canada, I've lived within the boundaries of the North Vancouver tidal estuary, the Mudflats, for more than 2 years. These are boundaries of environmental setting, source of material, and observation, and provided, he writes, the machinations of my squatter community, shaped by the lunar rhythms of the tide, no telephone, no electricity, few words. Now, Burroughs' intertidal installations drew inspiration from the drawings of the Russian artist Kazimir Malevich, whose work Burroughs had seen while studying in London. They spoke to questions of form and functionality, as well as the relationship and place of sculpture within the local landscape. This was connected to its environment, not imposed on it. It was the art subject to the action of the tides, and in Burroughs' own words, the anarchy of squatters, who often borrowed material from the sculptures, chromatically removing glass for a window and wood for a fire. It's against this backdrop that Burroughs began to understand squatting and self-help housing as a form of radical art making. Now, the protracted court case surrounding the status of the Maplewood squatters only reinforced this view. The case was held, ironically enough, in what is now the Vancouver Art Gallery. It became clear during court proceedings that a piece of alluvial sediment along the Mudflats had not been claimed by either the corporate district of North Vancouver or the National Harbors Board. In early December 1971, Burroughs, with the aid of a group of volunteers, successfully lowered his house, we can see it here in part, onto the no man's land, as it were, the legal gray area, if you like, using driftwood rollers. Now, when the building inspector arrived a few weeks later, court order in hand, to evict the Maplewood squatters, he torched Burroughs' house and most of the other shacks on the Mudflats. Now, this was, of course, an illegal act given the kind of legal complications at stake here in terms of intertidal squatting. And it's interesting that the same building inspector was actually responsible for the burning of Malcolm Lowry's shack many years earlier in the 1950s. Yet another example, if you like, of the rather arbitrary violence of the state against modes of informal housing that were deemed out of place. Though the same squatters, the same Maplewood squatters often overlooked the constitutive act of dispossession and resettling British Columbia and how this depended on a form of municipal colonialism, which was itself predicated on the erasure of indigenous sovereignty and territorial authority. Now, despite the fiery destruction of his house, Burroughs' working practice remained closely connected to questions of squatting. In 1974, he gave up his job at the University of British Columbia and moved to Hornby Island, where he constructed a new studio and residence. 2 years later, he participated in the UN Habitat Forum in Vancouver, where he worked as coordinator of information on non-tenured architecture, a role that brought him into contact with a number of leading experts on self-help housing and informality, including perhaps most importantly, the architect and urbanist John Turner, whose now classic book, Housing by People, appeared in the same year. It was Burroughs' responsibility to collate, curate, and assemble a series of conversations with squatters from London, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Paris, but equally a group of architects, planners, and activists from the global south as well. And he was also part of conversations that would coalesce around the Vancouver Statement of 1976, itself an early document in a global history of urban informality and marginality, and where many of the kind of questions about the empiricism and epistemological assumptions of informality that we talked about by way of introduction to this session, I think, were first mapped out. Now, the original typed manuscripts from these discussions still exist, and actually Tom gave a copy of them to me, but they are a product of the pandemic and are sitting in a locked cabinet in my office right now in Oxford. But they nevertheless represent, I think, a key document in the emergence of not only squatting as an urban social movement in the 1970s, but also an important document set against much wider debates about urban informality and marginality. Obviously, Janice Perlman's Myth of Marginality appeared in the very same year as well, and I think that's an important document within the wider discursive field that I'm sketching out. Now, all this also inspired Burroughs, who embarked after Habitat 76 on a 7-month Canada Council-funded project on squatting and non-tenured housing in Europe, Egypt, India, and Southeast Asia. The trip led Burroughs to produce what he called Squat Doc, a project that consisted of a series of color photographs with accompanying text for each of the cities he visited, which he collected and put in a little black suitcase, which is now part of the Burroughs collection at the Belkin Gallery in Vancouver. As a combined visual and textual document, I'm saying the project was intended to be completely portable, and it traveled with Burroughs in this old suitcase, which was also exhibited as part of the work. Squat Doc was first shown as a series of slides at the Western Front Gallery in Vancouver in October 1978, and later at another gallery, the Carnegie Center, in 1983. Versions of the work were also exhibited in gallery squats and housing projects across Europe. So I think what I'm building up to in the context of this brief foray into the early history of squatting in Vancouver is that the emergence of a new squatting movement in the 1960s and 70s and its relationship, if you like, to other forms of self-help housing and urban informality in the global north and south emerged from one of its most distant outposts. This is a story, if anything, shaped, as I've already intimated, by a series of basic and largely unresolved contradictions between the city and the surrounding countryside, between occupation and the resettlement of British Columbia and the dispossession and displacement of its indigenous inhabitants, between forgotten histories of informal housing and recurring cycles of creative destruction, between tactics of care and survival, but equally new forms of creative resistance and subversion. Now, the very nature of Burroughs' journey, both literal and otherwise, mirrors in many ways my own research trajectory from settler colonial state through the history of squatting in Europe to a more plenary approach to housing informality. And while I don't want to overwork the brief episode in the history of squatting in Vancouver, it does gather together a number of themes that I wish to examine the remainder of my talk, namely the uneven production of housing informality as a historical process and its long-standing relationship to the housing question, the enduring relationship between squatting and basic questions of shelter and necessity, the entanglements of law, land, and property in the making of housing informality, the role of housing informality as a mode of subjectification in producing certain subject effects, but equally the relationship of the precariously housed to the making of informality itself. But finally, also the need to recalibrate the kind of concept work we often attach to the study of housing informality, whether we're thinking of informality as a spatial marker, a practice, a mode of governance, a critique, a form of habitus, if you like, And of course, this imperative also extends to the ways in which we think about new research methodologies around housing insecurity. And so I'm speaking here in the spirit of the recent resource guide to housing justice produced by Ananya Roy, Raquel Rolnick, Hilary Molson, and others, as a medium for how we come to archive, document, and examine the long history of informality and illegality in the global north, while marking the institutional assemblages that we often associate with housing insecurity. And this process, I would argue, has a long history within housing movements. So the kind of empirical and epistemological mistakes that we often associate with the study of urban informality have in some sense already been addressed, or at least attended to or acknowledged through this wider archive and history. And I think there's something really interesting to build on there. Now, in my own context, and in my early work, I tried to write a kind of radical spatial history of squatting that was adequate to the experiences of squatters in the global north, though this was still in many ways a partial history shaped by the seductions of squatting, to borrow a phrase used by Ananya Roy. It was never my intention to apostatize a particular phenomenology of radical urban politics, but rather to explore the role that urban squatting play in how we come to think and inhabit the city. So with all that in mind, it's my intention this afternoon to begin to recalibrate my sightlines. I'm drawn here to what Foucault once called mobile thought to describe what it means to never cease to think about the same things differently. Now, for Foucault, it entails, as Anne-Laure Stoller has recently argued, keeping the concepts with which we work provisional, active, and subject to change. It entails retaining them both as mobile and as located as they are in the world. And all of this has acquired a certain urgency today. We are living through an intensifying housing crisis, the long durée of which stretches back to the global financial crisis, but equally a moment where the very idea of the city as a site of social transformation is facing an existential threat. And all of this has been amplified in various ways by the ongoing pandemic and the emergency urbanisms it has produced. So one of the main wages of this paper is that the current housing crisis has not only prompted a recrudescence of housing illegality in the West, it has also produced new informalities set against a backdrop of intensifying scarcity, new and long-standing logics of expulsion, as well as forms of urban carcerality characterized by criminalization and repression. At stake here are the terms of how we might think about housing irregularity and informality in an age of brutalism, to use a phrase recently adopted by Achille Mbembe. So what I want to do in the time that I have left is really offer a sympathetic addendum to the recent publication by Francesco and many others in Progress in Planning, which sets out to provide and develop a critical atlas of housing informalities, and their particular focus is Italy. But what I propose to do in the remainder of this time that I have in this paper is to telescope that particular project into the articulation of a broader conceptual framework for understanding housing irregularity, informality, and illegality in the global north. My intention is not, it should be said, to bracket off this project from a global geography of informality, but to reflect on the kind of concept work that might be adequate to describing the specificities that continue to produce a vast field of informal practices in so-called northern cities. So what I want to do is really offer 6 interconnecting interventions into the making of what I will provisionally call a spatial grammar of informality. And I want to begin with the phrase historical diagnostic here. And this, following Sarah Safransky, is really an attempt to conjoin the experiences and remainders of historical injustices with contemporary forms of urban theory and practice. It argues that such a diagnostic, with its commitment to transformative social change, depends on a historical mode of inquiry, and that housing informalities in northern cities are historically grounded in struggles over land, law, and property, but equally shaped by the predations of capitalist accumulation. They occupy a complex gray area between public institutions, legal regimes, and a constellation of informal practice and spaces that are routinely acknowledged, in some cases tolerated, and in other cases violently suppressed. And of course, for poor working class communities, they point to housing crisis that has always been the norm. These are communities that find common cause, in the words of Friedrich Engels, one of the more astute commentators on the housing question. He noted that the so-called housing shortage is not something peculiar to the present. All oppressed classes in all periods yet had suffered more or less uniformly from it. Now, elsewhere, I've tried to argue that we can see perhaps in squatting or urban squatting in particular phenomenology of occupation-based practices, a series of practices that represent the political other to creative destruction, such that we continue to find in the lives, spaces, and practices of squatters an alternative vision of the city that grows ever more necessary and urgent in the face of capitalist urbanization. Of course, it's certainly clear that cycles of capitalist accumulation generate their own cycles of irregular informal housing, though I perhaps downplayed the dialectical nature of this relationship in earlier work, insofar as certain forms of irregular housing, as well as broader patternings of marginality and vacancy, are themselves generative of new rounds of accumulation by dispossession. And in this context, there remains to be written a minor history of cities as seen through the lens of informal housing. There's a rich vocabulary and typology to draw on here in terms of informal housing in the West, whether we're talking about borgette, braque, corre, bidonville, Hoovervilles, tent cities, shanty towns, all of which in turn encompass a range of customary beliefs, makeshift practices, and coping mechanisms that have emerged in the absence of the most basic of necessities and beyond basic necessities, and exist beyond, though often in nebulous relation to the state and the law, and in some cases are actively produced by the state and the law. Now, the American journalist Ben Ehrenreich reminds us in an excellent long-form essay in The Nation, which is actually from 2009, what he describes as tent city, and he's writing about the city of Sacramento in California, is less a single location than a nomadic but constant phenomenon, a shifting blue tarp shadow to the glass and steel American metropolis. In good times and bad, tent city comes and goes, forms and scatters and takes shape again. Now, other scholars, of course, have tried to offer some shape and structure to these reflections. I'm thinking of Corey Parker's excellent essay on the history of informal encampments in Sacramento, Lisa Goff's history of the shantytown in the United States, not to mention Noah Durst and Jake Wegman's useful paper on informal housing in the United States, and the important, albeit often hidden, role that non-compliance, non-enforcement, and deregulation have come to play within housing, as well as a range of other activities such as urban farming, street food vending, and day labor. And of course, I think the papers that follow in the context of the symposium provide a much richer phenomenology of many of the kinds of practices that I'm talking about here. But more than this, the kind of historical diagnostic that I have in mind here also depends on a more expansive archive of informal housing. The baleful legacies of settler colonialism that I've briefly hinted at also prompt us to inject a hermeneutics of suspicion into the ways in which we conceptualize informality and its relationship to urban marginality. So, for example, my own experience in conducting research in Canada has demonstrated that land officials across the Canadian Dominion, stretching back to the 19th century, routinely mobilized and used the concept of squatters' rights as, on the one hand, a way of introducing market-based private property rights, and on the other hand, as a sort of Trojan horse that could provide entry for settlers to land that was initially ceded to indigenous communities. And this is, of course, a story that is repeated in the United States, in Australia, and many other places as well. And of course, in the settler colonial context, and in the US more specifically, we also need to be mindful of the history of slavery and the legacies of the assumed inhumanity of Afro-descendant populations. But equally, as the geographer Adam Bledsoe reminds us, acknowledge how the spaces created from the Black experience have also been the sites of emergent forms of being and unique existences. So for Bledsoe, Marronage and maroon communities during the reign of chattel slavery were, and I quote, settlements established, and these were settlements established by runaway slaves who sought to escape their condition as fungible accumulated property, unquote. And this relationship between informality, fugitivity, and survival should not be overlooked here. And it is this historical geography of insurgency and world making and its various afterlives that more recent forms of racial banishment have sought to abjure. And this takes me to perhaps the question of survival and how any attempt to gauge the recent revival of urban squatting in the wake of the global financial crisis must recognize that many of the informal practices and strategies adopted have themselves emerged out of a desperate search to meet the most basic of needs, shelter amid deep material inequality. What the sociologist Claire Herbert, in an important new book that's just come out actually on Detroit, refers to as a form of survival squatting. And as the geographers Don Mitchell and Nick Heyman remind us, the very question of how it is still possible, or practically impossible, for many people to inhabit and make a life in cities, the question of how the social and structural constraints on accessing even the most basic materials for human survival was, of course, a central preoccupation of another of Destroyed's more prescient interlocutors, the radical geographer Bill Bungay. And it was, of course, Bill Bungay who first talked or introduced this notion of a geography of survival as a way of describing the different spaces and spatial relations that shape how, and increasingly if, people are able to live in cities. And I've been recently thinking about precisely these geographies of survival in terms of the crisis of homelessness that has anything intensified in recent years across the global north. But working through understandings of survival, precarity, and vulnerability have also helped me to make sense of migrant struggles across Europe and the role that Fortress Europe has played in producing, on the one hand, new forms of control, detention, and surveillance, and on the other hand, pushing many people into irregular and often informal forms of housing, and also equally being exposed to certain forms of criminality and repression as well, while also serving as a catalyst for a new wave of squatting activism, especially across Southern Europe. So as institutional state-based forms of support give way to a revanchist necropolitics, I've been thinking and holding on to an understanding of informality as an infrastructure of care, and also about how informality may generate new institutions, informal institutions of care as well. I'm thinking in particular of Martina Capsali's brilliant paper in the Radical Housing Journal on refugee solidarity squats in Thessaloniki, and how the informal space of the squat is not only a political space of resistance in a kind of more conventional sense, but also equally a collective space of care that provides the material and effective scaffolding for new solidarities and subjectivities. Here, the space of the squat represents a space of convergence where local activists and migrants come together, but also a kind of, let's call it a counter-institutional space, one that's generative of new subjectivities or new ways of understanding, the political in an urban context. And this, I think, takes me to my third point, or my in terms of this wider spatial grammar, which is around informality and subjectification. In that paper in Radical Housing Journal, Capsali focuses on how the fabrication and assembly of an infrastructure of care marks a process of subjectification that is a process of collective world making. And my own research over the past few years in a similar context, I think points to an intensification of new forms of care work around housing informality, whether we're talking about the ecologies of support for homeless encampments in the US or from migrant and Roma communities across Europe. And as Capsali, I think, rightly reminds us, makeshift infrastructures are constitutively political. Through their construction, precarious groups claim their presence in the city, gaining visibility and asserting their own sense of being. They deny the identities given them by the state order and present themselves as active political subjects. I guess what I'm really interested in here is the relationship between informality and interpolation. That traditional understandings of housing informality often assumed a particular kind of subject and often name or designate that subject either as slum dweller, the homeless, the asylum seeker, the precarious worker, the Roma community, in some sense, and the squatter activist in many cases as well. These are ways of being that are routinely pathologized and subject to stigmatization and social exclusion. And of course, in some cases, romanticized as a source of sort of alternative forms of entrepreneurialism as well. But what, in this context, if we begin to think of informality as an alternative logic of subject formation, calling into being other ways of being and subsisting, and recognizing perhaps that subjectivity here in the context of informality often is about conferring a status of non-being and disposability. Of course, I'm thinking a little bit more speculative here, but I'm trying to posit a more insurgent mode of subjectification, especially when confronted with the predicament of being of no account to others, to borrow a phrase of Kristeva's. And so in the context of my own work, it's been partly about trying to document the everyday experience, practices, and sentiments of squatters across Europe and North America, but this could equally be applied to other subaltern communities, if we want to call it that, and of course, shading into notoriously thorny questions of who is speaking for whom and who's exercising agency within informal communities, and the wider ethical and political responsibilities we have in trying to attend to the relationship between informality and subjectification. But I'm thinking in particular of course, of Michele Lancioni's really important work with the Roma community in Bucharest. And he's right now working on publishing the account of one of the activists that was involved in recent activism in the city, which formed at least part of the backstory to the film Început Ploaia, I think, which is a really important document in trying to think through the question of urban marginality in our current conjuncture. But equally, Jessie Spears' work on the dismantling of homeless encampments in the US, and especially her commitment to trying to recover the voice of the homeless through oral history and memoir work, I think points to the generative possibilities of marking the informal as a site of subjectification in other ways, and also recovering other ways of being in an urban context. So I realize that I'm slowly running out of time, so I'm going to work through the other three propositions quite quickly, but I'm hoping that they partly help to sort of carve out a critical space for the rest of the symposium. Again, and perhaps this is partly a connection to recent events in Berlin, and obviously in terms of the German Supreme Court basically ruling that a rent cap was unconstitutional, raises wider issues in my head around the relationship between the law and housing insecurity. And as I was doing archival work for the chapter in the Autonomous City on Vancouver a few years ago, it became clear to me, as I already intimated, that in the 19th century, Canadian officials used legal preemption as a way of negotiating the growing number of squatters on Crown land. And in many other instances, settlers violently displaced Aboriginal people from their homes without even the formality of filling a preemption. So in some cases, the law became very quickly a technology of dispossession. And in fact, squatting itself became a technology of dispossession in this context here. But what I was struck by was how many First Nations communities mobilized the law on adverse possession in particular, to claim continuous use and improvement. So for example, this is a series of squatter shacks at Brockton Point on the edge of Stanley Park in Vancouver, where a First Nation community was threatened with eviction by the city of Vancouver. And they took this to the British Columbia Supreme Court and lost. But they then took it to the appeal court, which ruled in favor of the families and actually made a case that the families had actually, and the legal details are really interesting, that they had in fact demonstrated, and I quote, the minimum number of years to claim adverse possession. And Justice Matthews, and this is in the early 1920s, one of the three presiding judges, described the word of the Aboriginal witnesses as remarkable and beyond expectation precise. But he then goes on to also state that because there had been no express extinguishment of Indian title in British Columbia, the question whether there was earlier possession by the Crown was problematic anyway. And so this case was then taken to the Canadian Supreme Court, which was then overturned again. But I think there's something about the use of law and as a kind of technology of acknowledging not only the nature of housing informality, but also in creating certain frictions within legal systems that I find really interesting. And I'm thinking about Joanna Kuziak's recent paper in Area about how we might translate a growing geographical understanding of the wider legal dimensions of a neoliberal political economy and capital's rule of law into a committed engagement with legal activism, and in her own words, a strategic measure for both political action and scholarly action research. There's a lot more to unpack here in terms of not only legal geography in a descriptive sense, but in a more normative political sense as well. And this perhaps may open up some of the epistemological questions that this session began with. And again, these are just a couple of images from the context of the Brockton Point case, which went to the appeals court in British Columbia in the early 1920s. But is a really, it's worth kind of parsing in greater detail, because I think the original appeal court decision in the 1920s actually opened up a space for First Nations communities to make really powerful cases around adverse possession. And I think there's much more to unpack there. But I want to kind of wrap things up by saying two very quick things, and I apologize I'm running a little bit over, one about method and one about concept work. And I guess what I really wanted to say was that all of this brings me really to the question of method, and that recent work on housing informality has served as a decisive platform for generating new research methodologies and orientations towards housing justice. And obviously part of this has been an empirical project that seeks to account for new and enduring forms of housing insecurity, and as such direct a critical optic towards practices that have often remained invisible. And of course, many of the papers in this symposium speak directly to this impulse in really exciting ways. But I'm also interested equally in a more normative framework that on the one hand recognizes what Ananya Roy and others have described as a focus on structural mechanisms of dispossession, displacement, illegalization, and stigmatization, but equally process to generate strategies for emplacing communities as well, and move beyond a mode of critique that serves in Clyde Woods' terms as a mode of autopsy, but in fact to generate effort to realize a more just urban life as well. And of course, the kinds of practices we're talking about are numerous, whether we're talking about critical counter-mapping, other forms of geovisualization, alternative archiving, reparative record-keeping, participatory architecture, grassroots planning, ethnographic storytelling, eviction observatories, etc. And all of this in relation in many respects to institutions that themselves impose a rather different grid of intelligibility on the precariously housed. And of course, there are huge ethical stakes involved in this commitment, but especially in trying to avoid a form of double dispossession, insofar as not only recognizing the challenges that many communities face in terms of the possibility of being displaced or dispossessed, but also that their subject positions and their political commitments are being dispossessed in many ways by certain forms of scholarly activism. And those ethical injunctions are important to take seriously as well. And much of this commitment is obviously, I think shaped by an investment in a particular understanding of theory work and concept work as well that I wanted to end with. And I think we can talk a lot more about the role that Southern epistemologies have played in recalibrating the ways in which we think about housing insecurity. But I simply wanted to offer this paper in the end in the spirit of Theodor Adorno's well-worn reflections on the need to offer a corrective to theory's deprecation of the historically produced. I mean, his own focus is on a particular form of writing, but my aim is to really sketch out programmatically, it has to be said, a form of spatial history that is open-ended, fragmentary, and radically heretical. Now, as I've argued elsewhere, the conceptual armature required here must, to a large extent, mirror the very provisionality of different forms of housing insecurity. Now, this is invariably a history of particular kinds of institutions, a history of particular modes of governance, and a history of particular kinds of rules. And obviously, we'll be exploring this in a number of different ways in the days that follow. But if I retrace my steps back to those mudflats in North Vancouver, it's also a history about trying to imagine how we might begin to think about inhabiting the city differently. There's a normative impulse and injunction here. And I think the urgency of this project in all sorts of ways has never been greater. So I think I will leave it there. And I just want to thank the organizers once again for giving me the space to begin to work through these ideas. The only other thing I wanted to say again by way of conclusion is to offer a note of solidarity to tenants in Berlin who are, in the days to come facing, massive rent hikes in many cases in the context of the recent decision of the German Constitutional Court. So my solidarity to many people in Berlin with that in mind as well. And thank you to the organizers and thank you for your time.